Yesterday in the Oval Office, President Trump said something that is generating massive controversy. And if you only saw the outrage headlines, you completely missed the actual complexity of what is happening here. When asked about releasing video footage of a September 2nd strike on an alleged drug boat in the Caribbean, a strike that killed survivors from an initial attack, Trump said, "I don't know what they have, but whatever they have, we'd certainly release, no problem." Then when pressed on whether Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth or Admiral Mitch Bradley should face consequences if survivors were indeed killed while clinging to the boat, Trump responded with 3 words that reveal his entire strategic framework. This is war. Not a metaphor, not hyperbole. His actual position is that the United States is in a state of war with drug cartels, and the normal rules of peacetime law enforcement don't apply. And that position, whether you agree with it or find it terrifying, represents a fundamental shift in how America approaches drug trafficking that has massive implications for foreign policy, for military operations, for international law, and for what happens next in Latin America. Let me walk you through what actually occurred, because the facts matter before we can assess the legal and moral questions. On September 2nd, the U.S. military conducted what Trump called a kinetic strike against what he identified as Tren de Aragua narco-terrorists in an alleged drug boat. That initial strike killed some of the crew and apparently disabled the vessel. But here is where it gets complicated. According to multiple sources, there were survivors. People who didn't die in the first strike were still alive, were clinging to the boat or in the water near it. And the military ordered at least one additional strike that killed those survivors. In total, 11 crew members died. The Pentagon confirmed the boat was struck more than once, though initially the administration only disclosed the first strike. This wasn't revealed until the Washington Post reported it, and now it has become a major controversy, with Democrats calling it potentially a war crime, with some Republicans demanding to see the video evidence, with legal experts questioning whether killing survivors violates international humanitarian law. But here is the thing that makes this more complex than the simple war crime narrative. A source familiar with the incident told ABC News that the survivors were deemed still in the fight and considered valid targets because they had climbed back onto the boat, were believed to be potentially in communication with others in the vicinity, and were salvaging some of the drugs that had been the boat's cargo. Now, if that characterization is accurate, if survivors weren't surrendering or incapacitated, but were actively continuing their mission, then the legal analysis changes significantly. The question isn't just did we kill survivors? It is what were those survivors doing, and did they remain combatants under the laws of armed conflict? And that distinction is everything, because killing people who've surrendered or are incapacitated is absolutely a war crime. But killing people who are still fighting, who remain threats, who are actively engaged in hostile action, that is legal, even under strict interpretations of international humanitarian law. The controversy centers on which of those 2 scenarios actually describes what happened. Now let's talk about Trump's legal framework here, because understanding it is crucial to understanding where this is headed. The Trump administration has designated drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and has stated that the U.S. is in a non-international armed conflict with those cartels. That is not just rhetoric. That is a specific legal classification that triggers a different set of rules than normal law enforcement operations. In peacetime law enforcement, you can't just blow up boats because you suspect they're carrying drugs. You need warrants, due process, rules of evidence. You intercept vessels, you board them, you arrest people, you seize contraband, you prosecute through the justice system. But in armed conflict, even non-international armed conflict, you can use lethal force against combatants without warning, without arrest, without trial. You can strike targets based on intelligence without needing courtroom, quality proof. You can kill people who are actively engaged in hostilities against you. Trump's position is that drug cartels have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans through fentanyl and other drugs. He cited close to 300,000 deaths last year alone. From his perspective, that is not crime. That is an attack on America that justifies a military response. And once you accept that framing, once you classify this as armed conflict rather than law enforcement, then striking drug boats becomes analogous to striking enemy combatants in any other war. The cartels are the enemy, the boats are enemy assets, the crews are enemy combatants, and you use military force to destroy them, just like you'd use military force against any other enemy in wartime. Now here is the controversial part. Congress hasn't authorized this war. There is no declaration of war against drug cartels. There is no authorization for use of military force, specifically targeting them. Trump is acting on what he claims is inherent executive authority as commander-in-chief to defend the nation against threats. Some legal scholars argue that is constitutional. Others argue it is a massive overreach that violates the separation of powers and gives the president war-making authority Congress never granted. The other major legal question is whether this actually qualifies as non-international armed conflict under international humanitarian law. That classification requires organized armed groups engaged in sustained hostilities of a certain intensity. Drug cartels are definitely organized. They definitely use violence. But are they engaged in armed conflict with the United States specifically? Or are they criminal enterprises that happen to ship drugs to America? That distinction matters enormously because it determines which body of law applies. If this is armed conflict, then you apply the laws of war, and striking combatants is legal. If this is law enforcement, then you apply domestic and international criminal law, and what Trump is doing could be extrajudicial killing, which is absolutely illegal. Trump has made his choice about which framework applies. He is treating this as war. But that choice isn't universally accepted by international law experts, by Congress, by allied nations, or by human rights organizations. And that is why this is so controversial. Now let's address the specific question about accountability, about whether Hegseth or Bradley should face consequences, because Trump's answer reveals his entire approach to military leadership. When directly asked if anyone should be punished if survivors were killed while clinging to the boat, Trump deflected. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, "I think you are going to find that this is war," and redirected to the broader mission of taking out drug boats. Then when pressed specifically on whether he supports the decision to kill survivors, he said, "No, I support the decision to knock out the boats. And whoever is piloting those boats, most of them are gone, but whoever are piloting those boats, they're guilty of trying to kill people in our country." That is a carefully constructed answer. He is not explicitly endorsing killing survivors. He is endorsing destroying the boats and killing the people operating them. The distinction allows him to avoid taking a clear position on the most controversial part while still defending the overall operation. But here is what is interesting about the accountability dynamic. The administration has been very deliberate about pointing to Admiral Bradley as the commander who made the decision for the second strike. Hegseth initially said he watched the operation live, suggesting he was intimately involved, but then he revised that, saying he watched only the first strike live and learned about the rest hours later. That revision matters because it creates distance between Hegseth and the controversial follow-up strike. If Bradley made that call, if Bradley determined the survivors were still in the fight and ordered the additional strike, then Bradley is the responsible official, not Hegseth. And Bradley is a 4-star admiral with decades of experience in special operations. He is not some rogue actor. He is one of the most senior military officers in the country. If he made a tactical decision in the heat of an operation that survivors remained valid targets, that decision gets enormous deference under military law. Courts are extremely reluctant to second-guess battlefield commanders, making real-time targeting decisions under uncertain conditions. So Trump's position appears to be that Bradley acted within his authority, that the decision was justified based on the intelligence and circumstances at the time, and that no one should be punished because this was a legitimate military operation against enemy combatants. That position will be tested. Bradley is testifying behind closed doors to Congress. Lawmakers, including some Republicans, want to see the video evidence. They want to understand exactly what happened, what the survivors were doing, whether they posed continuing threats, whether the decision to strike again was reasonable under the circumstances. And Democrats are calling for investigations, suggesting this could be a war crime, demanding accountability if the military killed people who had surrendered or were incapacitated. The video, if released as Trump says he is willing to do, will be crucial. It will show whether survivors appeared to be fighting or surrendering, whether they were salvaging cargo or trying to escape, whether the characterization of them as still in the fight holds up to visual scrutiny. But let's zoom out and look at what this controversy reveals about Trump's broader anti-drug strategy. Because the boat strikes are just the beginning of what he is planning. Trump said Wednesday, "Very soon we're going to start doing it on land too. We know every route, we know every house. We know where they manufacture this crap. We know where they put it all together. And I think you're going to see it very soon on land also." That is not hypothetical. That is a direct statement of intent to expand military operations from sea-based strikes to land-based strikes inside sovereign nations, primarily Venezuela, but potentially other Latin American countries. If that happens, we're talking about a massive escalation. We're talking about us military conducting strikes on targets within foreign countries without those countries' consent, possibly without congressional authorization, based on the same war, against cartels framework Trump is using for the boat strikes. Think about what that means from a systems perspective. The boat strikes happen in international waters or close to them. Legally murky, but at least there is no clear violation of another nation's sovereignty. Land strikes are different. If you are striking targets inside Venezuela, inside Colombia, inside any other country, you are conducting military operations on their territory. That is traditionally an act of war unless you have their permission. Now, Trump would argue the governments of those countries are either complicit with the cartels or incapable of stopping them, and therefore the U.S. has the right to act in self-defense. But that is not how international law typically works. Self-defense under the UN Charter requires an imminent threat and proportionate response. Drug trafficking, however deadly, doesn't meet the traditional definition of armed attack that triggers self-defense rights. So Trump is essentially rewriting the rules of when military force is justified, claiming a new doctrine of preventive war against non-state actors who pose threats through drug trafficking rather than through conventional military means. And here is why that is so significant. If the United States can unilaterally strike targets in other countries based on drug trafficking concerns, what is the limiting principle? Can Russia strike Chechen groups in European countries? Can China strike Uyghur networks in Central Asia? Can any country claim self-defense against transnational threats and conduct military operations across borders without consent? Trump's approach, if it becomes normalized, could fundamentally undermine the post-World War II international order that is built on sovereignty and limits on unilateral military action. Now, Trump would say that order hasn't been working, that American citizens are dying in massive numbers from drugs flowing across borders, and that traditional law enforcement approaches have failed for decades. He'd argue desperate problems require desperate measures, that when hundreds of thousands of Americans are dying annually from drugs, you can't just keep doing what hasn't worked. You need to use military force to destroy the supply chains at their source. That is a coherent argument, but it is also terrifying to anyone who values international law, sovereignty, and the constraints on military force that have helped prevent major wars. So where does this go from here, and what should Americans understand about what is unfolding? First, expect these boat strikes to continue and probably escalate. Trump has conducted upward of 20 strikes so far, killing more than 80 people. Those numbers are going to keep climbing because he sees this as working, as disrupting cartel operations, as sending a message that America will use lethal force against drug traffickers. Second, expect land strikes to begin soon, possibly within weeks. Trump keeps threatening them, keeps saying he knows where the targets are, keeps promising it is coming. That is not bluster. That is preparation. He is conditioning the public to accept a major escalation. When those land strikes happen, probably in Venezuela first given the tensions with Maduro, we're going to see a much bigger international reaction. Boat strikes in international waters are controversial, but limited. Land strikes inside sovereign nations will generate condemnation from international organizations, from allies, from human rights groups, potentially from Congress. Third, expect the legal battles over this to intensify. Democrats are already questioning Trump's authority to conduct these operations without congressional authorization. If land strikes begin, those questions will become louder and more urgent. There will be lawsuits challenging his authority, congressional resolutions trying to limit the operations, international legal proceedings, potentially alleging violations of international law. Trump will fight all of that, claiming commander-in-chief authority, arguing Congress gave him the tools he needs through previous authorizations and military funding, insisting that protecting Americans from deadly drugs justifies these extraordinary measures. Fourth, expect the video release if it happens to be a major moment. If that footage shows survivors clearly surrendering or incapacitated and then being struck, it will be devastating, politically and legally. If it shows survivors actively continuing hostile action, salvaging cargo, communicating with others, then it supports the administration's position that they remained valid targets. The visual evidence will shape public opinion and potentially legal proceedings. And fifth, understand that Trump is betting his approach resonates with Americans who are exhausted by the drug crisis, who've seen family members destroyed by addiction, who've watched communities devastated by fentanyl, who want someone to do something dramatic rather than just continuing failed approaches. He is betting that even if the methods are controversial, even if international law experts condemn them, even if there are tragic mistakes, like killing people who shouldn't have been killed, enough Americans will support aggressive action that the political pressure works in his favor. That might be right. Polling shows Americans are deeply concerned about drugs and willing to consider military responses. Or it might backfire if the costs become too high, if civilian casualties mount, if international isolation damages American interests, if Congress pushes back effectively. If you found this analysis helpful and want to understand how Trump's anti-drug strategy is fundamentally changing American foreign policy, hit subscribe. Drop a comment with your honest take. Do you think military strikes against drug boats are justified? Should survivors be killed if they're salvaging cargo? Does this qualify as war, or is it extrajudicial killing? Your perspective matters because this affects how America uses military force and whether traditional legal constraints still apply.